London, a cold February morning. The wet streets reflected the city's golden lights as hurried pedestrians wrapped themselves in thick coats, bracing against the biting cold. But for Paul Carter, CEO of Carter and Company, the temperature outside didn't matter. The only thing on his mind was the financial report glowing on his phone screen as his car sped down the familiar road. At 38, Paul was one of London's most powerful businessmen. He was cold, rational, and in complete control of every aspect of his life, except for one thing: his daughter, Mia Carter. Paul had never imagined himself as a single father. He had once been married to Evelyn, a beautiful, intelligent woman who had never wanted to be tied down by family life. Shortly after giving birth to Mia, she left behind a brief note and disappeared from his life forever. Paul had won full custody, but he had never truly been a father in the emotional sense. His work consumed all his time, and Mia grew up surrounded by nannies, prestigious schools, and every luxury money could buy. But there was one thing Paul couldn't purchase: the genuine bond between a father and his daughter. And then, one chaotic morning changed everything. A chaotic morning. Paul woke up at 5 a.m. as usual, starting his day by reviewing financial reports. A crucial board meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., and he had no time for distractions. Everything was going smoothly until his housekeeper called. "Sir, I'm sorry to inform you that Mia's nanny won't be able to come in today. She has a high fever." Paul paused for a moment. "How soon can we get a replacement?" "I've called several agencies, but the earliest anyone can arrive is in the afternoon." Paul exhaled deeply, feeling the onset of a headache. He couldn't leave his daughter home alone, but missing the meeting was not an option either. With no alternative, he decided to take Mia to school himself. Mia, a 4-year-old with soft curls and big round eyes, happily bounced into the car. "Daddy, you're really taking me to school today?" "Yes," Paul replied quickly, his eyes still scanning emails on his phone. "Then will you play with me?" Paul sighed, not looking up from his screen. "I have a meeting, but if you behave, I'll pick you up early and we can spend some time together." Mia beamed, clutching her beloved stuffed bunny. The car sped through the bustling streets. As they neared the school, Paul glanced at his watch. 7:45 a.m. If he hurried, he could still make it to the office by 8. He turned onto a familiar street where Elite Kids Academy, Mia's prestigious private school, was located. But just a few buildings away, along the same route, stood another preschool, Sunshine Haven. The signs of the two schools weren't drastically different, and with his mind preoccupied with work, Paul didn't notice his mistake. He pulled up in front of Little Wonders, briefly glancing at the modest building with colorful playground equipment. Less grand than he remembered. But Paul didn't have time to second guess. He stepped out, unbuckled Mia, and helped her down. "All right, sweetheart. Time to go." Mia blinked, tilting her head toward the green-painted gate ahead. "Daddy," she hesitated, "am I supposed to go here today?" Paul didn't look up, adjusting her scarf instead. He assumed she was just stalling, like any other child reluctant to go to school. "Yes," he said firmly, "but if you're good, I'll pick you up early, and we'll have some fun. Okay?" Mia still seemed uncertain, staring at the school entrance. Before she could say more, Paul opened the gate and gently ushered her inside. "Be good, I have to go," he said, closing the gate behind her without a second glance. As it shut, Mia stood still for a moment, her wide eyes scanning her surroundings. Her school didn't have a playground like this. Her school didn't have hand-painted murals on the walls. And that wasn't the principal she remembered. A strange unease settled in her chest. Before her, a woman with long brown hair and kind eyes approached, crouching to her level. "Hello there," she said with a warm smile. "What's your name?" Mia tightened her grip on her stuffed bunny. "Mia Carter." The woman's smile briefly faltered. She glanced around, then checked the student roster in her hand. That name wasn't on the list. Laura Brooks, the owner of Sunshine Haven, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and in that moment she realized that someone had just made a very big mistake. "Welcome to Soul Stories. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a I am happy in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter, together. A morning mistake. Soft morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Sunshine Haven, casting a warm glow over the cozy room adorned with colorful drawings. Children ran and played, their bright laughter filling the air. Laura Brooks stood in the middle of the room, her gentle brown eyes watching over them. At 30 years old, she had spent nearly a decade working with children, caring for them with all the love she had. As the founder of Little Wonders, a small but nurturing preschool, Laura saw this place as her second home. But this morning, when she turned and saw a little girl standing uncertainly at the front gate, clutching a well-loved stuffed bunny, she knew something wasn't right. Mia stood still, her tiny hands gripping the soft, cream-colored bunny that still carried the familiar scent of home. She looked around, blinking, trying to find something familiar, but everything felt foreign. At Elite Kids Academy, Mia's usual school, everything was pristine. A marble-paved courtyard, quiet hallways bathed in warm lighting, teachers in elegant uniforms who maintained strict discipline. But here everything was different. The yard was covered in lush green grass, with a few children laughing as they played on a seesaw. In one corner, a wooden table held a collection of drawings where a small group of kids sat coloring, freely chatting with one another. There were no rigid rules about keeping silent, no strict disciplinary guidelines. Mia swallowed hard. Daddy said he'd pick me up early, and then we'd go out together, she whispered to her bunny, as if reassuring herself. The front door opened, and a woman with long brown hair loosely tied back stepped out. She wore a soft blue sweater and simple jeans, but her face carried a warmth that was both inviting and gentle. "Hello there." Laura crouched to Mia's eye level, her voice as soft as a breeze. "What's your name?" Mia hesitated, her big round eyes filled with uncertainty. "Mia Carter." Laura's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly scanned the student list but didn't find Mia's name. "Mia," Laura said gently, studying the child closely. "I don't see your name on today's list. Are you sure this is your school?" Mia shook her head, her voice growing smaller. I don't know, but Daddy said I should stay here. He'll pick me up early so we can go out." Laura could hear the confusion and hesitation in Mia's voice. A child being dropped off at the wrong school was rare, especially at a private preschool like this. Something wasn't right. A call that went unanswered. Laura led Mia into her small office, a cozy space with a wooden desk and bookshelves filled with fairy tale stories. "I'm going to call your daddy, okay?" Laura said kindly. Mia nodded but remained silent. Laura searched through the small bag Mia had with her and quickly found an emergency contact card. She dialed the number listed under Guardian, Paul Carter. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, no answer. Laura tried again, still nothing. She frowned, forcing herself to stay calm. A misplaced child with no way to reach their guardian. This was not a situation she could ignore. She turned back to Mia. The little girl sat quietly in the chair, clutching her bunny tightly, her expression filled with uncertainty. Laura took a deep breath. "It's fine. As long as Paul Carter comes back soon, everything will be okay." But what if he didn't come back soon? Making Mia feel safe. Laura decided she wouldn't leave Mia alone in the office. Taking the little girl's hand, she led her outside. "How about we go play for a bit? Do you like coloring?" Mia looked up at Laura, her wide brown eyes full of hesitation. Finally, she gave a small nod. Laura brought her to the outdoor wooden table, where a few children were busy coloring with bright crayons. "Mia, what do you like to draw?" Mia hesitated for a moment, then set her bunny down on the table and picked up a pink crayon. After a few minutes, she began sketching. Laura sat beside her, watching quietly without interrupting. Little by little, Mia started to relax. A blonde girl sitting next to her peeked at Mia's drawing and smiled. "Wow, you draw so well." Mia blinked, then gave a small, shy smile. A few minutes later, she wasn't gripping her bunny so tightly anymore. She even started chatting softly with the other children, her voice no longer trembling. Laura let out a quiet sigh of relief. Watching Mia slowly open up, she couldn't help but wonder. What kind of environment had this child grown up in? A 4-year-old wouldn't end up here by herself. Her guardian had clearly made a mistake. But what intrigued Laura the most was Mia's reaction. She hadn't thrown a tantrum or insisted on leaving, even though she had been visibly confused at first. Throughout the morning, Laura kept trying to call Paul Carter, but there was still no answer. A sense of frustration started to build. What kind of father doesn't realize he dropped his child off at the wrong school? In her years of working with children, Laura had encountered all types of parents, those who were overly protective and those who completely entrusted their kids to others. Was Paul Carter the latter? By the time the clock struck 3 p.m., Laura realized something troubling. Paul still hadn't returned for Mia. She glanced toward the playground, where Mia was happily playing with the other children, a bright smile on her face. Laura picked up her phone, ready to call one last time. But before she could dial, the front doorbell rang. She turned and saw a tall man in a perfectly tailored gray suit step through the gate, his sharp gaze scanning the area. Laura immediately knew this was Paul Carter, and she was more than ready to have a very serious conversation with him. A mistake he couldn't ignore. Paul Carter was a man who didn't accept mistakes. In business, he controlled everything. Every number, every decision, every meeting meticulously planned and executed. But this morning, in his rush, he had made a mistake even he hadn't seen coming. It wasn't until he stepped out of the boardroom at 3 p.m. that he finally had time to check his phone. And when he saw over 10 missed calls and a string of messages from an unfamiliar number, his pulse slowed for just a fraction of a second. Laura Brooks. Mr. Carter, I am a teacher at Sunshine Haven. Your daughter, Mia Carter, was mistakenly dropped off at our school. I have been trying to reach you all day without success. Please call back immediately. Paul's grip on his phone tightened. What? A cold sensation crept down his spine. He immediately checked his car's GPS history, tracing back his route that morning. And then, it all made sense. Shit. He had dropped Mia off at the wrong school. Without another thought, Paul stormed out of the building, striding toward the Bentley waiting in front of his company. It took 15 minutes to reach Sunshine Haven, but every second in the car felt like an eternity. When the vehicle finally came to a stop, Paul stepped out immediately, his sharp gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar surroundings. Everything here was different. Unlike the prestigious private school Mia attended, this place felt more modest, more inviting, but he had no time to dwell on that. Paul pushed open the gate and instantly locked eyes with Laura Brooks, the woman who had been trying to contact him all day. She stood near the playground, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of frustration and disapproval. Paul did not like being judged, and he definitely didn't like being judged by a preschool teacher. Mr. Carter, you finally made it, Laura said, her tone blunt and unapologetic. I had an important meeting, Paul replied curtly. Where's my daughter? Laura raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Do you have any idea how many times I tried calling you? She demanded, her voice edged with sharp criticism. A 4-year-old child was mistakenly dropped at the wrong school, and her guardian was unreachable all day? Do you really think that's an acceptable excuse? Paul clenched his jaw. I don't owe you an explanation for my schedule. No, but you owe it to your daughter, Laura shot back without hesitation. Mia was confused and anxious when she got here this morning. She didn't understand why she was in an unfamiliar place. Did you even consider what that must have felt like for her? A tight, uncomfortable feeling settled in Paul's chest. He didn't like being lectured, especially not about parenting. This was a mistake, and I'm here to fix it, he said coldly. I came to take Mia home. But before Laura could respond, a small voice rang out. Daddy! Paul turned sharply, just in time to see Mia running toward him. Paul turned his head, instantly spotting Mia running toward him. She wore a pale blue knitted dress, her soft brown curls slightly messy. But what struck him the most was not her joyful expression. It was the way she clung tightly to Laura's hand as she ran. Daddy! Mia shouted, her bright eyes lighting up at the sight of him. You're here! Paul knelt down, opening his arms, expecting his daughter to leap into his embrace. But Mia didn't move. She simply stood there, her small hand still holding on to Laura's, as if she wasn't ready to let go. A faint sense of unease crept into Paul's chest. Are you ready to go home, sweetheart? He asked, keeping his voice even. Mia bit her lip, looking down at the ground. Daddy, she hesitated. Can I stay a little longer? Paul frowned. What did you just say? Mia lifted her gaze, her round eyes shimmering with uncertainty. I like it here, she said softly. Miss Laura is really nice. She even read me a story. Paul stilled. He studied his daughter, the same child who had always been quiet, withdrawn, and never easily attached to anyone, not even the carefully selected nannies who had cared for her since birth. And yet here she was, holding on to a complete stranger as if she had known her forever. Something about that unsettled him. Laura remained silent, but there was something in her gaze, a quiet challenge. Paul straightened, regaining his usual composure. I'm glad you like it here, he said, his tone controlled, measured. But this isn't your school. We need to go home. Mia shook her head. No, I want to stay. Her voice rose, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Paul stiffened. Mia, don't be stubborn. He lowered his voice, trying to stay calm. I already told you. We're leaving. But I don't like my school. Mia suddenly burst into tears, gripping Laura's hand even tighter, as if she were afraid Paul would take her away. It's not fun. Miss Laura is nicer. Paul felt as if someone had just punched him in the gut. The words struck deep, sharp, and unexpected. This teacher had managed to make his daughter love this place so much that she didn't want to leave. His eyes flickered toward Laura, narrowing slightly, but she only shrugged, her expression unreadable. Mr. Carter, Laura finally spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. Maybe you should listen to what your daughter is trying to tell you. Maybe Mia is saying something you haven't noticed before. Paul did not like those words. He did not like the way Laura seemed to understand something he himself had failed to see. But for the first time, he couldn't ignore it, because Mia had changed in just one day. Paul clenched his fists, a strange, unsettling feeling twisting in his chest. For the first time in his life, Paul Carter didn't know what to do. For the first time, he realized that there was something money and power couldn't control. And for the first time, he faced the possibility that, maybe, just maybe, he didn't know his daughter as well as he thought. And the woman standing before him, Laura Brooks, was the one who had made him realize it. Nothing in Paul Carter's life was ever out of control. For nearly 2 decades, he had built his career from the ground up, meticulously managing every number, every decision, and every person in his orbit. But today, because of one small mistake, he found himself in a situation completely beyond his grasp. And all because of Mia Carter, his daughter, who suddenly didn't want to go back to her prestigious school, Elite Kids Academy. Daddy, can I go back to Little Wonders tomorrow? A change he couldn't ignore. On the drive home, Mia sat quietly in the back seat, hugging her stuffed bunny tightly. She had been silent for a long time, but when the car finally stopped in front of their high-rise apartment, she spoke. Daddy? Her small voice broke the silence. Paul glanced at her through the rearview mirror. What is it, sweetheart? Mia hesitated before whispering, Can I go back to Little Wonders tomorrow? Paul frowned. No, Mia. Your school is Elite Kids Academy, not that place. Mia's lips pressed together, her voice barely above a whisper. But I like it there more. Paul shut off the engine, turning to face her fully, his sharp gaze locked onto hers. Mia, you can't just go somewhere because you like it. Elite Kids Academy is the best. You'll make good friends, have great teachers, and get the best education. Mia tightened her hold on her bunny, her big brown eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But Miss Laura isn't there. Paul stilled. That was not the answer he had expected. He refused at first. That night, Paul sat on his leather sofa, a glass of wine beside him, while his phone buzzed constantly with work emails. Yet he couldn't focus. Mia's words kept playing in his mind. But Miss Laura isn't there. Paul frowned and opened his laptop, searching for Sunshine Haven. The school was nothing impressive. A small private preschool, primarily serving middle-class and low-income families. No elite curriculum, no prestigious reputation, nothing that made it worth considering for his daughter. And yet, Mia preferred it. How is that even possible? Paul shook his head, shutting the laptop. He wouldn't allow it. Mia deserved the best. But 2 days later, Paul realized something was wrong. Mia still woke up on time for school, but she wasn't excited anymore. She no longer smiled at her classmates at Elite Kids Academy. She didn't talk about her lessons. She wasn't interested in new toys. And at dinner, Paul noticed something even worse. Mia barely touched her food, poking at her plate in silence. "Mia, why aren't you eating?" She barely shook her head. "I'm not hungry." Paul frowned. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Mia hesitated, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "You said you'd pick me up early, but you never do." Paul froze. A tight knot formed in his chest. He had promised. "If you're good, I'll pick you up early and we'll go out together." But he never did. He had meetings, he had contracts, he had deadlines. He was always busy, and now his daughter was pulling away because he broke his promise. Paul inhaled sharply, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He couldn't let this continue. Finally, he sighed. "Mia, if I let you go back to Little Wonders for a week, will you eat properly?" Mia's eyes lit up instantly. "Really? Damn it," Paul thought. He was already losing control. "Just 1 week." His voice was firm. Mia nodded enthusiastically, the first genuine smile on her face in days. And Paul knew, from this moment on, he had stepped into something he could no longer control. The next morning, Paul drove Mia back to Little Wonders. This time, he didn't leave right away. Leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, he watched as Mia ran inside. Near the entrance, Laura Brooks stood waiting, greeting Mia with a warm smile. She knelt down, saying something softly to the little girl, and Mia giggled. Paul narrowed his eyes. Mia never warmed up to people this quickly, and yet with Laura, she acted like they had known each other for years. When Laura turned, her gaze briefly met Paul's, just for a second, before she disappeared into the classroom. Paul didn't get into his car immediately. He sat there thinking, who is Laura Brooks? And why does Mia trust her so much? That afternoon, Paul arrived earlier than usual to pick Mia up. Instead of going in, he stopped by the fence watching through the playground. Laura sat on a wooden bench, a small child curled against her. She gently stroked the child's hair, whispering something softly. Paul frowned. He turned as a teacher walked by, lowering his voice. "How long has Miss Brooks worked here?" The teacher blinked, surprised by his question, then smiled. "Laura, she's the founder of Little Wonders." Paul froze. "She's the founder?" "Yes. She lost her family in an accident years ago. After that, she dedicated her life to helping children." Paul felt something shift inside him. He didn't know much about Laura Brooks, but suddenly she wasn't just a preschool teacher. She was someone who protected children, and maybe, just maybe, Mia had seen that before he did. Paul Carter wasn't the kind of man who changed easily. Numbers, precision, and control, those were the pillars of his life. He had built his empire on the certainty that everything could be calculated, predicted, and controlled. But ever since Mia started attending Little Wonders, that certainty had begun to slip through his fingers. And the worst part was, he wasn't sure if he wanted to control it anymore. At first, he picked Mia up right at dismissal, but then gradually he started arriving earlier. First just a few minutes, then half an hour, and one day he was there a full hour before Mia's class ended. He told himself he was just checking on the environment, making sure his daughter wasn't being influenced by a less sophisticated school. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the real reason. Because every time he stood by the fence, watching through the classroom windows, he saw something he had never seen before. He saw Mia truly happy. She played with other children without hesitation, unlike at Elite Kids Academy, where she had always been a bit reserved. He saw Laura kneeling to Mia's eye level, listening intently, as if every word his daughter said was the most important thing in the world. And for the first time in his life, Paul felt jealous of a woman. Laura challenged everything Paul believed in. One afternoon, when Paul arrived earlier than usual, he found Laura cleaning up the classroom after story time. She glanced at him but didn't seem surprised. "You're early today, Mr. Carter." She raised an eyebrow, her voice light but tinged with amusement. Paul slipped his hands into his pockets, casually scanning the room. "I was just passing by." Laura smirked, clearly not buying a word of it. "You seem more interested in this place than I expected," she remarked as she stacked books on the shelf. "I thought people like you only cared about expensive schools with fancy reputations." Paul's jaw tensed slightly. You think I only care about money? Laura shrugged. Isn't that true? People like you can buy anything. But a child's love, that's something money can't buy. And I think you're starting to realize that. Paul's sharp eyes locked onto hers. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. But the thing that unsettled him most wasn't her attitude. It was the fact that she was right. He didn't respond. He simply held her gaze for a long moment before turning and walking away. But deep inside, something had already shifted. That night, as Paul tucked Mia into bed, she clutched her stuffed bunny tightly, her eyes glowing with excitement. Daddy, Mia whispered, Miss Laura told us the story of Peter Pan today. She tells stories so well. Paul gave a small, amused smile. Oh, yeah. Yes, Mia nodded eagerly. She said that anyone can fly, as long as they believe they can. Paul paused, watching his daughter closely. Mia had never talked about a teacher like this before. At Elite Kids Academy, the teachers were undoubtedly more qualified, more experienced, more prestigious, but none of them had ever made Mia light up like this. And that realization kept Paul awake for the rest of the night. A rainy night, and Paul got stuck at the preschool. A week later, when Paul arrived to pick up Mia, the rain had begun to pour heavily. He stepped inside, frowning slightly as he spotted Laura helping a group of small children into their raincoats, making sure they were ready to go home. Where's Mia? He asked. Laura glanced up at him, holding his gaze for a second before gesturing toward the corner of the room. Paul followed her line of sight and saw Mia kneeling down, carefully tying another child's shoelaces. A strange warmth spread through his chest. Mia had never been this outgoing before. At Elite Kids Academy, she had always been a bit reserved, preferring to stay on the sidelines rather than actively engaging with other kids. But here she seemed different, more open, more confident. But before Paul could dwell on the thought, a sudden crack sounded from outside. A staff member rushed in, looking alarmed. Miss Brooks, I think a tree branch just fell on the Bentley parked outside. Paul immediately turned. My car? Laura blinked, then let out a quiet chuckle. Looks like you'll have to stay for a while. Paul clenched his jaw, already reaching for his phone to call his driver. No signal. He frowned and tried again. Still nothing. Laura tilted her head. With this heavy rain, the reception might be down. Would you like to wait inside? Paul opened his mouth to refuse. His instinct was always to decline unnecessary interactions. But when he glanced outside, the sky was pitch black, and the rain wasn't letting up anytime soon. He exhaled sharply, then gave a small nod. Just for a little while. A conversation about life, family, and loss. Laura led Paul to a small reading nook inside the preschool's library. She disappeared for a moment, then returned with 2 cups of steaming hot tea, placing one in front of him. Do you drink tea, Mr. Carter? Paul raised an eyebrow. I usually only drink coffee. Laura smiled. Well, try it today. He studied her for a second before taking the cup, bringing it to his lips for a small sip. It was pleasant. Unexpectedly so. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Laura finally broke the silence. Mr. Carter, why were you so reluctant to let Mia stay here? Paul set his cup down. Because I want my daughter to have the best future. And you think Elite Kids Academy is the only place that can give her that? It's one of the top private schools. Laura smiled, shaking her head slightly. But does it make Mia happy? Paul didn't answer. For the first time, he truly didn't know. Laura studied him for a moment before speaking again, this time in a softer voice. I know that feeling. Paul frowned. What feeling? Laura lowered her gaze to her tea, turning the cup slowly in her hands. Wanting to control everything. She paused. Wanting to protect the people you love, only to end up pushing them further away. Paul's heartbeat slowed for a second. It was strange. He had never talked to anyone about his fears, the fear that if he didn't control everything, things would fall apart. Yet somehow Laura understood it without him saying a word. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside this small room, between 2 people from completely different worlds, something was changing. Everything changed after that rainy night. Paul couldn't deny it. For a fleeting moment, as he sat next to Laura in that small, warm room, sipping hot tea, listening to her steady voice as she shared her past. Something inside him shifted, a feeling he had never allowed himself to experience: warmth, connection. It hit him without warning, a wave of emotion he had spent years avoiding, crashing over him before he had a chance to build his walls back up. And it terrified him. Paul Carter was not a man ruled by feelings. He was calculating, controlled, decisive. But Laura made everything feel out of control. She was nothing like the women he had known. She didn't belong in his world. Paul had spent years around powerful, ambitious women, the kind who could stand beside him at high-end galas, who could discuss market trends and investment strategies with ease, women who thrived in the same competitive, ruthless world he did. But Laura had no ambition for wealth or status. She didn't care about power or networking. She cared about children, about giving love to those who had none, about creating a home for the ones the world had overlooked. She was a woman who lived with her heart, and that made her the biggest threat to him, because if he let her in, she could make him love her. And if he loved her, she could hurt him, just like Evelyn did. No, worse than Evelyn did. Because unlike his ex-wife, who had walked away seeking freedom, Laura wouldn't be the one to leave first. Paul knew himself. He knew his workaholic tendencies, his inability to balance career and emotions, the way he threw himself into business at the expense of everything else. If he let Laura in, he wouldn't be able to give her what she deserved, and he refused to be the one to break her. So he stepped back. Paul walked away. The next day, Paul arrived at Little Wonders to pick up Mia, but this time he didn't step inside. He didn't linger by the fence, didn't observe Mia laughing with her friends, didn't search for Laura's presence the way he had unconsciously started doing every day. He simply stood by the gate. When Laura finally appeared, she hesitated for just a second, noticing the distance he had placed between them. But she didn't say anything. She simply smiled at Mia, reminded her to stay warm, and then glanced at Paul, a silent, knowing look. Paul said nothing, just a short nod. Then he took Mia's hand and turned away. The next day he did the same, and the day after that. No more conversations, no more moments of quiet understanding, no more lingering glances that lasted longer than necessary. Paul cut it all off as if nothing had ever happened. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, every time he turned his back, he could still feel Laura's eyes on him. Silent, deep, knowing. She knew. She knew he was running away, but she didn't chase after him. She didn't ask why. She didn't demand answers. She didn't try to hold on to something he wasn't willing to fight for. Because Laura Brooks wasn't the kind of woman who begged a man to stay. If he wanted to leave, she would let him go. And somehow that hurt Paul more than anything else. Mia noticed the change. No matter how well Paul hid his emotions, there was one person who still noticed. Mia. "Daddy, you don't smile at Miss Laura anymore." One evening, as Paul switched off Mia's bedroom light and turned to leave, her small voice stopped him. "Daddy?" Paul paused, turning back. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mia hesitated. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her round eyes watching him carefully, as if debating whether to say what was truly on her mind. And then she whispered, "You don't smile at Miss Laura anymore." Paul froze. His heart skipped a beat. His voice remained steady. "What are you talking about?" Mia bit her lip, her innocent gaze filled with quiet observance. "Before, when you picked me up, you always talked to Miss Laura. You smiled a lot." She tilted her head slightly, her voice dropping to a soft murmur. "But now, you don't say anything. She doesn't smile anymore either." A strange, painful crack formed inside Paul's chest. Mia was only 4, yet she had picked up on something even he tried to ignore. She wasn't a child who usually noticed adult emotions, but this change between him and Laura, it was so obvious that even Mia could sense it. "I think Miss Laura is sad." Paul held his breath. Mia's voice was even softer now. "I think Miss Laura is sad." Paul said nothing, because what could he say? That she was right? That he was the reason Laura was sad? That he was sad too? Because he was. He was sad when he saw Laura's eyes growing more distant each day. He was sad knowing that he was the one creating that distance. He was sad that he was pushing away the only woman who had ever made him feel something real. But the fear, his old, deep-rooted fear, was still there. He couldn't let himself love Laura. He couldn't let himself fall. "Aren't you sad too, Daddy?" Mia blinked up at him. "Aren't you sad too, Daddy?" Paul didn't know how to answer. Instead, he reached forward, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Go to sleep, Mia." Mia pouted but didn't press further. She nodded slowly, pulling her bunny closer, her small fingers curling into the fabric. Paul quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. And then he stood there in the hallway, staring at nothing. Paul thought he could keep running, so he kept pretending. He kept his distance. He convinced himself that it was the right choice. But there was one thing Paul had forgotten. Feelings aren't something you can suppress forever, and soon he would no longer be able to escape them. Because when a man tries to run away from love, love always finds a way to pull him back, harder, stronger, and more relentlessly than ever before. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. Mia's words echoed in his mind over and over, like a relentless drumbeat. "Daddy, you don't smile at Miss Laura anymore. Aren't you sad too?" Paul Carter was not a man who wasted time dwelling on emotions. He was a man of logic, of reason, of control. But tonight, logic failed him, because the emptiness inside his chest was too real to ignore. Of course, he was sad. He was sad when he no longer heard Laura's soft laughter when he picked Mia up. He was sad when her warm gaze no longer sought him out. He was sad because he had pushed her away, all because of his own fear. And now Laura was gone. She no longer waited for him. She no longer looked for him in the crowd. She no longer held even a flicker of expectation in her eyes when she saw him. And for the first time, Paul realized he had lost the most important thing in his life. At 6 a.m., Paul sat up in bed. He glanced around his perfect, spotless apartment. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly as he had designed it. And yet, for the first time, it felt cold, empty. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't live without Laura. Without hesitation, Paul grabbed his car keys and left. When Paul arrived, the preschool had yet to open. But as he stepped inside the small courtyard, he saw her. Laura. She was crouched down, carefully tending to a row of small flower pots, gently adjusting the soil around the plants. The early morning light bathed her in a soft glow, her brown hair falling lightly over her shoulders, her movements graceful and delicate. Paul stopped in his tracks, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He had spent weeks trying to distance himself from her. He had convinced himself that this was the right thing to do. But now, just looking at her, he knew. He had been lying to himself all along. Paul took a step forward. Laura, sensing his presence, stood up, turning toward him with wide, surprised eyes. "Paul?" Her voice held a note of confusion. Paul took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I need to talk to you." Laura blinked, glancing around. Several teachers and parents were arriving early, their curious gazes flickering toward them. "Can we talk later?" she asked quietly. "No." Paul shook his head. "I need to say this now, right here." Laura stiffened, caught off guard. Paul stepped closer, his deep blue eyes locked onto hers. Louder this time, so that everyone around them could hear, he spoke. "Laura!" Laura's breath hitched. "I have spent my entire life trying to control everything." His voice was steady but raw with emotion. "I built my world around certainty, around never making mistakes, never losing anything important." A hush fell over the small crowd. Teachers and parents exchanged glances, whispers beginning to stir. Laura couldn't move. "But because I was so afraid of losing control, I made the biggest mistake of all. I lost you." Laura felt her heart stop. "I was afraid to love you." Paul's voice thickened. "Because I thought that if I let you in, you could hurt me. The way I've been hurt before. I thought that if I let myself care too much, I would fail you. Fail to give you the time, the love, the commitment you deserve. And that one day, you would walk away." A soft gasp escaped from someone in the crowd. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying the weight of Paul's words through the morning air. But Laura didn't hear any of it. She could only hear the man standing before her, bearing his soul in a way she never imagined he would. "But in the end, I realized something." Paul stepped even closer, his voice a whisper only for her. I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of anything else. Laura couldn't breathe. Paul Carter, the man who had spent his entire life avoiding emotions, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding love, was standing in front of her, in front of everyone, confessing that he loved her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Laura was moved, but she tested him. The air felt frozen in time. Everyone held their breath, waiting for Laura's response. Her heart pounded against her chest. She wanted to believe him. But was he really ready? Was this just a moment of emotion? A grand declaration made in the heat of realization? Or had Paul Carter truly changed? She studied him, searching his face, his eyes, looking for something real. Then she inhaled deeply, her voice slightly unsteady but firm. If you really want me, she said, then prove it. A challenge Paul was willing to accept. Paul didn't blink. Instead, something shifted in his gaze. Something determined, certain, unwavering. Laura had never been a woman who believed in mere words. She believed in actions. And for the first time in his life, Paul knew. He was ready to prove himself. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his hand reaching for hers. His voice was steady, deep and resolute. I will prove it. The promise hung in the air, vibrating with a weight that neither of them could ignore. And in that moment, Laura knew. Maybe, just maybe, Paul Carter wasn't running away anymore. Maybe for the first time, he was running toward her. Paul didn't just say he loved her, he proved it. After that day, Paul didn't just make promises, he fulfilled them. He no longer came to Little Wonders just to pick up Mia and leave in a rush. Now every morning he brought his daughter to school, lingering for a moment to watch her, to make sure she was truly happy there. Before he left, he always knelt down to adjust Mia's backpack, press a soft kiss on her forehead, and, without fail, send a glance toward Laura. A look filled with unspoken gratitude and quiet devotion. He spent more time with Mia, not through expensive gifts or extravagant trips, but through small, meaningful moments. Every night, instead of letting the nanny read Mia a bedtime story, he did it himself. His deep voice was sometimes clumsy, but filled with warmth. Every weekend, he took her to the park. He rode the Ferris wheel with her, bought her ice cream, chased her around as she laughed uncontrollably. One afternoon, Laura happened to pass by and saw him carrying Mia on his shoulders, both of them laughing, looking nothing like the cold businessman she once knew. He taught Mia how to ride a bike, even though it had been years since he had last done it himself. When she fell, he didn't rush to pick her up. Instead, he crouched down, gently encouraging her. You can do it, Mia. Daddy's right here. He helped Little Wonders in his own way. At first, Paul only did small things, fixing a stuck door, installing a new toy shelf, but soon he became more involved. He donated a large sum to renovate the school's playground. But what surprised Laura the most was that he didn't just write a check and leave. He personally supervised the renovations, even helped paint some of the walls himself. One day, Laura walked past the playroom and found him helping a little boy tie his shoelaces. His movements were still a bit awkward, but his patience was undeniable. The boy looked up at Paul, eyes shining with admiration, as if that moment was the most important part of his day. And Laura felt something deep in her chest shift. Yellow tulips and handwritten notes. On Monday morning, Laura entered her classroom and froze. A bouquet of vibrant yellow tulips sat on her desk. A small card was tucked between the petals. She picked it up and traced the elegant handwriting, "For the woman who made a rigid CEO learn to slow down and see life differently." And Laura smiled to herself, shaking her head. Paul Carter, romantic? She never would have believed it. But this wasn't a one-time thing. Every week, a new bouquet appeared on her desk. Sometimes red roses, sometimes soft blue hydrangeas. Each came with a small note. Always simple, always unexpected, but always making her smile. A little color to brighten your day. I've never given flowers to anyone before. You're the first. Did you think about me today? An invitation that changed everything. One afternoon, while Laura was cleaning up the classroom, Paul arrived earlier than usual. But today, he didn't wear his usual suit. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up, his stance relaxed, effortlessly charming in a way Laura wasn't used to seeing. Are you free tonight? His voice was casual, but his eyes held something hopeful. Laura raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me out to dinner? Paul smirked. Number, I'm inviting you over. To my place. So I can cook for you. Laura blinked, genuinely surprised. Paul Carter can cook? He shrugged with confidence. You might be surprised. A warm dinner in a cold penthouse. When Laura stepped into Paul's luxurious penthouse, she expected a formal dining setup, an expensive bottle of wine, maybe even a private chef. But the first thing she saw was Paul himself, standing in the kitchen, still in his white shirt, now wearing a black apron, carefully chopping vegetables. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, amused. You're really cooking? Paul glanced at her, his lips curling slightly. Did you think I only knew how to order takeout? Laura laughed. Honestly, yes. He shook his head, returning to his task. Mia loves my pasta. I figured you might too. Laura watched him, the way his brows furrowed in concentration, the way he tasted the sauce with the tip of a spoon, the way he seemed so at ease in his own space. This wasn't the Paul Carter she had first met. This was a different man, a man who had changed, who had let go, who had allowed himself to love. More than just a meal. When Paul finally served the meal, Laura had to admit, his pasta was actually delicious. But what captivated her the most wasn't the food. It was the way he looked at her throughout the entire dinner. Software steady, as if she was the only thing that mattered in that moment. As he poured her another glass of wine, he finally spoke. I'm not great at expressing emotions. He exhaled, meeting her gaze. But I want you to know that I'm trying. Not just for Mia, for you. Laura's heart skipped a beat. So, you're trying to win me over? She teased. Paul placed his glass down, tilting his head slightly. His voice was low, warm, and unwavering. Number, I'm trying to make sure you never leave me. Laura didn't answer immediately. For the first time, she didn't pull away. She let their eyes lock, let the silence between them speak. Let the unspoken emotions fill the space between them, and for the first time, she allowed herself to think. Maybe this is exactly where I belong. Paul wasn't just trying to win her over. He was changing, for himself, for Mia, for the family he never thought he could have. And Laura realized something she had been fighting all along. She was falling deeper and deeper in love with Paul Carter. And this time, she wasn't afraid to let it happen. A proposal like no other. 6 months later, everything had changed. Laura was no longer just Mia's teacher. She was no longer just the woman Paul had fallen for. She was the center of his world. That afternoon, Laura was busy tidying up the classroom after playtime. Paul arrived at Little Wonders, as usual. But this time, he didn't wait outside. He walked inside. And when Laura looked up, she noticed something different in his eyes. Something intense. Something unchangeable. Is everything okay? She asked, tilting her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. Paul didn't answer. Instead, he did something that made her entire world stop. He knelt down. The fairy tale moment. Laura froze. The classroom fell silent. Nearby teachers paused what they were doing. A few children started whispering excitedly. And then, a little girl gasped in delight. It's just like a fairy tale, she squealed. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a diamond ring that sparkled brilliantly under the afternoon sun. But it wasn't the ring that stole Laura's breath. It was Paul's eyes, deep, unwavering, completely sure, a love that changed him. Laura Brooks. Paul's voice was steady, rich with emotion, loud enough for everyone to hear, but meant for her and only her. I used to be afraid of love. I used to think love was something I could control, something I could avoid. He took a slow breath, ignoring the dozens of eyes on them, focusing only on her. But then you came along, and you changed everything. Laura bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. Paul continued, you taught me that happiness isn't in what I own. It's in the little moments, the quiet kindness, the way you made me a better man just by being you. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. A promise, not perfection. Paul swallowed, his voice thick with sincerity. I won't promise to be perfect, but I promise to try every single day, to be a man you can trust, a man you can love. Slowly he reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, solid, certain, steady. His eyes burned into hers, filled with nothing but hope, love, and devotion. "Marry me, Laura." And in that moment, Laura had spent her whole life believing in love, but she had never believed it would come like this. So raw, so real, so unshakable. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her lips trembled, and as her eyes met Paul's, she knew her answer. She couldn't believe it. The man who once feared love, who once kept his distance, who once refused to let anyone in, was now on one knee asking to spend forever with her. Tears spilled down Laura's cheeks, but they were not of sadness. They were of pure, overwhelming joy. She let out a soft, breathless laugh through her tears, then nodded, strongly without hesitation. "Yes," her voice trembled. "I say yes." A new beginning. A wave of cheers erupted around them. The children jumped up and down, their voices filling the room with excitement. Teachers smiled warmly, their eyes gleaming with happiness. And then, Mia ran straight into their arms, hugging them both tightly, her little face glowing with joy. Paul rose to his feet, his hands steady as he slipped the ring onto Laura's finger. Then, without another word, he pulled her close, wrapping her in his embrace, as if he would never let go again. And Laura knew. This wasn't just a promise. This was real. Paul had changed. He had chosen her. 1 year later, a wedding by the sea, under the golden sun, with the ocean breeze gently sweeping through the air and waves softly kissing the shore. Paul Carter and Laura Brooks became husband and wife. The wedding was simple but warm. Not a grand, extravagant affair filled with high-profile guests, not another billionaire spectacle. But to them, it was perfect. Mia, dressed in a lovely white dress, giggled and clapped, bouncing excitedly as she watched her parents share their first kiss as husband and wife. But the most special moment of all, Laura placed a gentle hand on her stomach, her eyes sparkling as she leaned into Paul and whispered, "I have good news." Paul froze, then slowly pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "A baby?" Laura nodded, her smile radiating warmth. Paul exhaled sharply, his eyes lighting up like never before. Then, without a second thought, he crouched down, placing his hand over her belly, feeling the warmth of the new life they had created together. Mia rushed to their side, wrapping her arms around them. "I'm going to have a little brother or sister?" she squealed. Paul let out a quiet laugh, pressing a kiss to his daughter's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "We're going to be a family full of love." And as he stood there holding his wife, his daughter, and the future growing within Laura, Paul knew this was what he had been searching for all along. Not just power, not just success, not just control, but love. Love that he gave freely, love that he received unconditionally. And as Laura leaned into him, her fingers intertwined with his, he finally understood. The greatest success in life isn't measured by wealth or achievements. It's measured by the love you choose to give. And Paul Carter had finally learned how to love. From a powerful CEO to a devoted family man, Paul Carter once believed that his empire, his company, his wealth, his success, was all that mattered. But that was before Laura, before Mia, before he discovered that the greatest empire he could ever build wasn't in a boardroom, but in the warmth of his own home. Paul gradually stepped back from his company, delegating responsibilities to his senior management team. For the first time, he no longer felt the need to control everything. Instead, he chose to be present. Mornings were no longer a rush to the office. Instead, he sat at the breakfast table with Laura and Mia, sharing simple meals filled with laughter and conversation. Afternoons, he picked up Mia from Little Wonders, staying longer to read stories to the kids, repair broken toys, and sometimes, much to his own surprise, be roped into playing superhero games. And with each passing day, a new idea took root in Paul's mind. One evening, as Paul and Laura sat together on their porch, watching the sky turn golden, Laura let out a quiet sigh. "I always wonder," she murmured, her eyes distant, "if there had been more support centers for single mothers, maybe fewer women would have struggled alone. Maybe more children would have received the love they deserved." Paul stilled. He looked at his wife, the woman who had turned her own wounds into a mission to help others, and he understood. It was time for them to do something greater. Months later, Hope Haven was born, a center dedicated to supporting single mothers, providing a safe space for abandoned children, and offering shelter to the elderly with nowhere to go. Laura led the community programs, providing counseling, education, and emotional support. Paul used his business expertise to secure funding, build infrastructure, and ensure that the center operated seamlessly. But beyond signing checks or making executive decisions, Paul was there, every day, in the heart of it all. Paul wasn't just the businessman behind Hope Haven. He was the hands-on, sleeves-rolled-up man who showed up every single day. He spent hours fixing an old wheelchair for an elderly woman, even though it would have been easier to just buy her a new one. He sat and listened as a single mother poured out her struggles, then found ways to help her secure stable work. And some afternoons, Paul found himself surrounded by giggling children, letting them play with his hair, draw on his arms with markers, and treat him like their personal jungle gym, all while smiling without complaint. Laura watched all of this with a quiet, overwhelming happiness. This was the same Paul Carter who once measured success in stock prices and business deals. But now, he was a man who measured his worth in smiles, in laughter, in the lives he touched. Paul was no longer the cold, distant CEO the world once knew. He was the man Laura had fallen in love with, a man who gave love without expecting anything in return. But what he never expected was how much love he received in return. In the warm hugs of children who finally felt safe, in the grateful eyes of people whose lives he had changed, in the adoring gaze of his wife, who loved him now more than ever. Love wasn't a destination, it was a journey. Paul once thought love was a weakness, that it was something he could control or avoid. But now, standing in the middle of Hope Haven, with Laura's hand in his, with Mia's laughter filling the air, Paul finally understood. Love wasn't about taking, it was about giving. And the more he gave, the more he received. Love wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And on that journey, the greatest way to love was to share it with the world. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.